So the basics on heat. Where does heat travel? Now, heat travels from hot to cold. That's important in refrigeration because basically that's what we do. We move heat from one place to another. Now, they are relative terms, hot and cold. So if you think 40 degrees C, that's hotter than 30 degrees C. But if you turn it around, minus 30 is actually hotter than minus 40. So heat is a relative term, so is cold. Now, in refrigeration, we take a process heat and we transfer that to a cold refrigerant inside a heat exchanger, our evaporator. And then we take that hot refrigerant and in turn transfer that heat to a colder medium in another heat exchanger, i.e. the condenser. So if we look at our system, now the vapor compression cycle, it comprises of four processes. We have compression, we have condensation, we have expansion, and we have evaporation. On the screen, you can see a nice little diagram. And as we said, the purpose of refrigeration is to take heat from one location where we don't want it and expel that heat to another location where it doesn't matter. Could be air, could be water, could be another medium. Now, in this example that's on the screen, we take heat from within the cold room and we expel it via the condenser to the outside ambient air. And flowing around our system is our refrigerant, and that is the heat transport medium. It absorbs the heat in the cold room as the air is taken over the evaporator and around the cold room from the product. This heat then causes that refrigerant to evaporate, thereby absorbing that heat from the cold room. So we're moving the heat from the cold room. And then that heat is expelled via the condenser to the outside ambient air or other medium. Could be a water-cooled condenser, for example. This is a very, simplified summary of each component within our system. So we have our compressor, can be compared to a pump. To me, it's the heart of the system. We have our condenser, which is our heat exchanger. Then we have a liquid receiver, which stores excess refrigerant in times of high or low demand. We have a couple of shut-off valves in the system. We have a filter dryer. So the job of the filter dryer is to remove moisture from the refrigerant and clean the refrigerant of any foreign particles. As I always say, bricks and spanners. Then we have a couple of sight glasses in the system. And you'll notice that there is a sight glass after the filter dryer, but I've also put a sight glass ahead, basically, of the expansion device. If you have a very long liquid line to your expansion device, I like to say it's good practice to put a sight glass up there so then you can see what quality of liquid is hitting your expansion device. If you've got a very long line of liquid, it's always good to see what's ahead of the valve itself. Then we have a shut-off. Then we have a Solmed valve, which is a shut-off device that can be used for control purposes, such as pump down. Then we have our expansion device, which is, it's the control for superheat in the evaporator, and it gives us that pressure drop between high side and low side. Then we have our evaporator in the cold room, which is, as we said, there to absorb the heat. It's a heat exchanger. We have a thermostat, which is our on-off control. Do we want cooling? Do we not want cooling? And then we have a pressure safety device, LP, HP, to look after the working pressures of the system. So that's a system, very, very basic. And if it's a small commercial system or a large industrial system, the processes are exactly the same. So we move on to things like load and balance and equilibrium. Now, in a basic system, there's only really one path for the refrigerant to flow through, and I liken it to a series circuit in electricity. What flows in one area must flow in the rest of the system. So, as we said, the main concept here is that flow through the system must be balanced, and it must be balanced by the pumping capacity of the compressor. Now, this state can be referred to as equilibrium. In that state, all the pressures and temperatures don't change. And we see this when the load and the ambient conditions are constant. So the system is ticking along, if you like. It's providing refrigeration, it's doing what it's doing, but the load and the ambient conditions are absolutely constant. So think of our expansion device. So the expansion device on the left-hand side, as we say, is ticking along. It's providing refrigeration, but everything is the same. And then let's say one of the parameters changes. We get airflow over the evaporator. It becomes warmer. Maybe somebody's opened the door of the cold room. Maybe somebody's put warm products in there. And that system will be, that equilibrium will be broken and the system conditions will begin to change. Now, in this case, that expansion valve is going to begin to open and inject, or open more and inject more refrigerant into the evaporator because we have load. We are removing heat from our cold room. So moving on to, again, we're talking about load and pressures and so forth. On this slide, we have two cylinders in the shape of a dumpy. And the dumpy on the left-hand side, we have R449A, 20 psi, and we have roughly 0.3 kilograms of refrigerant in that vessel. Now, if we increase the pressure in that vessel to 40 psi, we will have a greater amount of refrigerant in that cylinder. So that cylinder, or this cylinder, contains 50% more refrigerant than this cylinder. Now, as we say there, for a certain volume, the higher the density of the vapor, the more mass it will contain. And it's mass that we move around the system. So coming on to things like pressure drop within a system, and these are all relevant for the slides later on when we're talking about our compressor, which is, as we said, the heart of the system. Now, if we look at two pieces of capillary tube, small diameter copper pipe, if we have a 7.5 bar differential, yeah, we move refrigerant through it. Now, if we have a higher differential on the bottom one, which is 14.5 bar, we'll actually move more refrigerant or greater flow across that pipe than we will the pipe above. So again, remember that when we're talking about compressors and duty within the system. So then thinking about the same thing regarding pressure drop and the ambient effects. Now, the pressure difference is the difference between condensing and evaporating pressures. If we have an increase in our condensing pressure, that results in a greater refrigerant feed through the evaporator. That's why we use things like head pressure control. So if we have a cool day, we don't move as much refrigerant. On a hot day, we move more refrigerant. That's why we, as I said, that's why we use head pressure control in a condenser. So as we're talking about the vapor compression cycle, now this presentation wouldn't be complete without a slide showing a pH diagram. In very simple terms, the pressure enthalpy diagram, or pH diagram, shows how the pressure of a refrigerant, which is our fluid, changes when the heat, now that's the enthalpy, is given to the refrigerant or taken from the refrigerant. Enthalpy can be a very confusing concept, and basically I sort of think of enthalpy as energy or heat. The more heat you give to the refrigerant, the higher the enthalpy of that refrigerant. Now, since pressure is directly proportional to temperature, the pH diagram also provides us with the temperature of the refrigerant at any given conditions. Now, we can see on our pH diagram, if we click there, we have the saturation curve. On the right-hand side of that curve, everything is vapor. So everything to the right-hand side of that curve is vapor. And then everything to the left-hand side of that curve is liquid. And then in the middle, we have a liquid vapor mix. So that's the basics of our pH diagram. So looking